I was 28 years old at the time, and I had been dating Emily for a little over a year. We both really enjoyed hiking and used to take advantage of any time off to drive into the Colorado backcountry and spend the day on the trails. That particular late afternoon, we had done a moderate hike near a lightly visited mountainous area, not extreme, but far enough from the city to be quiet. We were tired and sweaty, with that good kind of exhaustion that comes after hours of walking. We decided to stop at an overlook before leaving because we knew the sunset there was usually beautiful. It wasn't a famous spot. There were no flashy signs or tourist infrastructure. It was basically a small gravel parking area, a low stone wall, and a view of the valley. When we arrived, there were no other cars around. We parked and spent a few minutes just looking at the scenery, talking about the hike and planning where to eat afterward. The sun was already very low, casting that orange light that tricks your sense of time and makes you forget that it's about to get dark for real. The wind was cold, typical of late afternoons in that region, and the place was absurdly silent. No cars passing, no human sounds, just the wind and a few birds. After a while, we started putting our backpacks in the trunk and taking off our boots, more focused on that than on the surroundings. At no point did we hear footsteps, an engine, or any sign that someone else had arrived. It was while I was crouched down adjusting something inside the trunk that I heard a voice behind us. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was calm, almost casual, as if the conversation had already been happening and I'd just missed part of it. He said something like, "That climb after the big pine is tiring, isn't it?" My body froze instantly. I stood up slowly and turned around, already feeling that chill run up my spine. A man was standing a few meters from the car, near the stone wall of the overlook. He was simply there. There was no sound of a car arriving, no footsteps on the gravel. He didn't seem out of breath or surprised to see us. He was far too calm. He kept talking, mentioning exact details of the trail we had done. He commented on a section where the path narrows near a drop-off, talked about how long it takes to reach the dry creek, and even mentioned the spot where we had stopped to drink water. These weren't generic comments. They were far too specific. I felt my stomach sink because we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. Emily went rigid beside me, holding one boot in her hand without realizing it. The man asked why we had chosen that specific overlook, said that almost nobody stops there, and smiled in a strange way without showing his teeth. The parking area around us was still completely empty, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. I answered briefly, trying to keep my voice steady, saying that we just wanted to watch the sunset before leaving. As I spoke, I tried to understand where that man could have come from. There were no visible trails leading directly to the overlook besides the road, and I was absolutely certain the parking lot had been empty when we arrived. He didn't look dirty, sweaty, or like someone who had just finished a long hike. His clothes were far too clean for someone who'd spent the day walking like we had. He stepped a little closer as he talked, closing the distance without asking, and began asking questions that no longer sounded innocent. He asked how long we had been together, whether we lived nearby, and whether we would return by the same narrow road or take the longer route. Each question felt calculated, as if he were building a mental map of our situation. Emily finally reacted and said we needed to leave because it was getting dark. The man tilted his head slightly as if analyzing the response and commented that it really does get dangerous to drive there at night because of animals on the road. It should have sounded like concern, but it didn't. It sounded like a warning. I closed the trunk harder than I meant to and said we were already leaving. He took a step back but didn't really move away. He just watched as we got into the car. When I sat in the driver's seat, I felt immediate relief at being inside with the door closed. Before starting the car, I looked in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, completely still, looking directly at us, with the entire empty parking area around him, as if that space belonged to him now. I started the car and pulled out of the parking area slowly, trying not to show any urgency. The road was narrow, two-way, lined with trees, and completely unlit except for our headlights. I was still watching the rearview mirror when I saw something that made my heart race even faster. A car that hadn't been there before turned on its headlights right behind us. It wasn't immediate, like someone who had already been sitting inside waiting. There was a brief delay, as if he had gotten into the vehicle at that exact moment, The distance between the cars was far too short for someone who was just casually leaving. Emily noticed at the same time I did and asked quietly if that was the man from the overlook. I didn't answer, but I kept looking in the mirror, already knowing the answer. For the first few minutes, I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. That road didn't have many exits, so it made sense that another car would be going the same way. Still, something didn't add up. The car behind us kept exactly the same distance. It didn't try to pass, didn't fall back. When I slowed slightly on a curve, it slowed too. When I gently accelerated on a straight stretch, the headlights closed in by the same amount. This wasn't natural traffic behavior. It was deliberate. The feeling of being watched returned strongly, even though I couldn't see the driver's face. The road began descending into tighter curves, and the darkness grew thicker between the trees. There was no cell service there. The dashboard showed no service, and that gave me an immediate sense of isolation. Emily stayed silent, staring straight ahead, but I could tell from the way she held the seatbelt that she was just as tense as I was. At a point where the road widened slightly, I deliberately slowed down, almost inviting the car behind us to pass. It didn't. It slowed too, maintaining the exact same distance. That erased any remaining doubt. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't someone just heading the same way by chance. After a few minutes like that, I started testing small changes, slightly swerving within the lane, accelerating and braking irregularly. The car behind responded to everything, as if it were connected to us. At one point, I passed a dirt road entrance leading to a forest maintenance area and signaled as if I were going to turn, just to see the reaction. The car behind slowed as well, and its turn signal flashed at the exact same moment. I abandoned the maneuver at the last second and continued straight. It followed. Emily finally spoke, her voice low and steady, saying that the man had known too much about us from the beginning, and that maybe he had been watching us on the trail the entire time. That idea made my stomach churn because it meant he hadn't appeared out of nowhere at the overlook. He had already been there before us. I drove on for several more minutes trying to stay calm, but my head was already full of worst-case scenarios. The road remained empty, with no clear options for help. No houses, no gas stations, no cars coming the opposite way. Just the two of us and that car behind us, constant, silent, with headlights always in the same position. At one point, Emily suggested turning on the hazard lights or stopping to let him pass, but the idea of being stopped on that road in the dark with that man filled me with immediate fear. I didn't know whether he just wanted to observe us or if he was waiting for a specific opportunity. It felt like any wrong decision could escalate everything. After some time, I spotted a sign indicating a small village a few kilometers ahead. That gave me a thread of hope. I thought that once we got closer to lights or a populated area, he would give up. I increased speed slightly, not abruptly, but enough to show we were trying to leave. The car behind did the same. The distance didn't change. On a straighter stretch, I could see the outline of the vehicle behind us more clearly. It was a dark, common car. Nothing distinctive. There was no interior light on, and I couldn't see who was driving. That made everything even more uncomfortable, because it felt intentional, as if he wanted to remain unseen. As we approached the first area with a few scattered houses, the tension in the car was almost unbearable. The lights were sparse and far apart, but they broke the absolute isolation of the road. I slowed slightly, hoping for a different reaction. The car behind slowed too. We passed a house with its porch light on and another with a truck parked out front, clear signs of people nearby. But he kept following. At a simple intersection, where the main road continued straight and a smaller street turned into the village, I signaled to turn right at the last second. I did it on purpose, abruptly, almost incorrectly. The car behind turned with us without hesitation. Emily whispered, "He's still coming," as if speaking louder might make things worse. That confirmed everything. There was no longer any doubt that we were being deliberately followed. My body went into automatic mode. I started scanning for any place that was clearly open or active. I saw a sign for a small gas station ahead, an old one with a single pump and a simple store. The light was on, and there was at least one car parked there. I pointed it out to Emily and said we were stopping there. I pulled into the lot without thinking twice, parked near the store entrance, and turned off the engine. For a few seconds, we stayed still, watching through the rearview mirror. The dark car passed straight by the entrance, slowed as if considering pulling in, and then continued down the road without stopping. We stayed there in complete silence, waiting until it was completely gone before truly breathing in relief. We sat in the car for several more minutes after that, saying nothing, just watching the road through the windshield and the rearview mirror, afraid of seeing the headlights return at any moment. My hands were tingling on the steering wheel from gripping it so tightly. Emily was breathing fast, trying to calm down, occasionally glancing at the store door as if deciding whether we should go inside. When we finally got out of the car, my legs felt strangely weak, like I'd run far too long a distance. We went into the station and bought 2 bottles of water that we never even drank, just to have an excuse to be there. The attendant looked bored, scrolling on his phone, completely unaware of what had just happened to us. That felt almost surreal, because the world seemed far too normal for the level of tension I was still carrying. We stayed there until we were sure we wouldn't see that car again. When we finally got back on the road, we took a different, longer route, just to avoid any chance of running into him again. We spoke very little the rest of the way. Every set of headlights that appeared behind us made my body react again, even though I knew it was probably just another driver. We never went back to that overlook or that trail. To this day, what bothers me the most is remembering that the parking lot was completely empty when we arrived, and that the man knew far too many details about us before even saying his own name. He didn't approach us in a hurry, didn't try to stop us from leaving. He just watched, followed, and then disappeared. And somehow, that's what makes everything much worse. After that night, we spent hours trying to reconstruct everything calmly, as if that could bring some logical explanation. We talked about timing, about the exact moment he appeared, about the fact that we hadn't heard absolutely anything before the voice behind us. Neither of us could explain how someone could appear like that in such an open, silent place without being noticed. It also made no sense that he knew such specific details about the trail, unless he had been observing us for a considerable amount of time. The idea that we might have been followed all day without noticing left me with a sense of vulnerability that took a long time to fade. In the days that followed, I tried looking for information about that overlook and the trail on local forums and Colorado hiking groups. I found nothing concrete, just a few old comments from people saying they avoided stopping there after sunset because the place felt strange. Nothing specific, nothing that explained what we experienced, no similar reports. That almost bothered me more than finding something similar, because it made everything feel isolated, as if it had only happened to us, with no record of that behavior. To this day, when I think about that night, what bothers me most isn't the fact that we were followed, but the way it all began. The natural way he spoke to us, as if he were already part of our story that day. He didn't show urgency, anger, or a direct threat, just too much curiosity, too much control, as if he were evaluating a situation before deciding what to do with it. Knowing that we got into the car believing we were alone when we clearly weren't still gives me a tight feeling in my stomach. We never stop at empty overlooks after sunset anymore. We never ignore that initial feeling that something is wrong just because we can't explain why. Maybe that man only observed us and decided not to go further. Maybe the gas station was a line he didn't want to cross, or maybe he simply lost interest when he realized we were no longer isolated. I'll never know. What I do know is that that night on a dark road in rural Colorado, someone chose us, followed us, and then simply disappeared from our lives, leaving behind only the uncomfortable certainty that not every encounter ends when you get into the car and drive away. Story 2. I'm 19 years old, and at the beginning of last fall I decided to do something I had been putting off for a long time: go camping alone for the first time. I live in North Carolina and chose a state park about a 2-hour drive away, a place known for having easy trails and a well-organized campground, with bathrooms and a fire pit area. I didn't want anything too wild, because I knew it would be my first night alone and I was trying to be responsible. I was in a bit of a stuck phase, college anxiety, that feeling that I just stayed in my room and never did anything different. So I thought a night away, with silence and cold air, would do me some good. I arrived in the late afternoon, checked in with the ranger, got my site number and headed to the camping area. There were a few families farther away and maybe one or two couples, but it wasn't crowded. My spot was near the edge of the woods with tall trees behind it and an open area in front. I set up the tent calmly, trying not to look like a complete beginner even though I was. The ground was kind of hard and covered in dry leaves, and the air was already colder than I expected. The late afternoon light made everything look nice, but I could already feel that silly anxiety of, what if I get scared later? I made a simple dinner on the camp stove, instant noodles, and sat for a while listening to the sounds of the place. Crickets, leaves moving, distant voices of people laughing somewhere closer to the center of the campground. Nothing felt threatening. I even felt a little proud of myself for being there alone, doing that. Before going into the tent, I went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, came back, and turned off my flashlight. I lay down in the sleeping bag with my phone on silent and stared at the tent ceiling, watching the shadows of the trees move when the wind passed. It took me a bit to relax, but I eventually fell asleep to that constant nature sound that, at first, even felt calming. I woke up in the middle of the night with that confused feeling of not knowing exactly what had pulled you out of sleep. It wasn't a loud noise, and it wasn't a specific dream. It was more my body reacting before my mind, as if something around me had changed. The air inside the tent felt heavier, warmer, despite the cold night outside. I stayed still for a few seconds, trying to listen better, my heart already racing without a clear reason. That's when I felt the tent move slightly, as if something had brushed against it from the outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there weren't any gusts and the movement wasn't coming from above, it was coming from the side, very close to my head. The fabric stretched a bit and then went back. I held my breath, trying to understand. Right after that, it happened again, stronger, as if someone were pressing against the tent with a shoulder or their entire body. The poles creaked softly, bending more than they should have. That wasn't wind, that was applied force. My whole body tensed up. I was lying on my side, facing the spot where the tent was being pressed, and the distance between my face and the fabric was minimal. On the other side, I couldn't see anything, just the dark shadow of the night. What panicked me the most was the sound. There were no footsteps, no talking, no leaves being stepped on. Just breathing. Very close, heavy, slow, coming from exactly where the tent was being pushed. It was low, almost controlled, as if the person were trying not to make noise. I felt a knot in my stomach and heat rising up my chest. My mind started racing, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. If it were an animal, there would have been other sounds. If it were someone passing by, they would have moved away. Whatever it was stayed there, pressing, breathing, bending the tent structure as if testing how far it could go. I stayed completely still, afraid even to breathe too loudly. The pressure on the side of the tent increased for a few seconds, strong enough that I could feel the pole pushing against the ground from the inside, like it might give way. The fabric brushed against my arm, cold and damp with dew, and that made me want to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. The breathing outside got closer, clearer, as if the person had leaned in even more. I could hear the air going in and out slowly, in a rhythm that didn't sound nervous, it sounded calculated. My mind was screaming at me to say something, to ask who was there, but my throat locked up. All I could think was that if I reacted the wrong way, things could escalate. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creaking of the tent being pressed and the breathing so close it felt like it was inside my ear. After a while that I can't really measure, maybe seconds, maybe minutes, my hand finally found the flashlight next to the sleeping bag. I gripped it tightly, taking a long time to gather the courage to turn it on. The pressure stayed constant, as if it were waiting for something from me. When I pressed the button, the light came on all at once, lighting up the inside of the tent and casting harsh shadows on the fabric. At that exact instant, the pressure stopped. It didn't ease off gradually, it stopped completely. The tent snapped back into its normal position, the poles stopped creaking, and the breathing outside simply vanished. I didn't hear footsteps moving away. I didn't hear running. Nothing. It was as if it had never been there. The silence that followed was so absolute it hurt my ears. I sat inside the tent with the flashlight on, pointing it in all directions, expecting to see some shadow move outside. Nothing happened. The normal night sound slowly returned. Crickets, leaves, a branch cracking far away, but nothing close to me. Even so, I couldn't relax. My body stayed on alert, as if it could come back at any second. I didn't have the courage to open the tent zipper and look outside. The idea of sticking my head out and finding someone standing there made me feel nauseous. So I stayed where I was, flashlight in hand, staring at the fabric, analyzing every mark and every crease. You could clearly see where the tent had been pressed. The fabric was stretched differently there. At times I thought I heard something, a tiny change in the air, and I held my breath again. Time passed very slowly. I didn't sleep anymore that night. When the sky started to lighten, that grayish blue typical of early morning, I finally worked up the courage to go out. My body was stiff and tired, and I felt kind of detached, like I'd spent the whole night in shock. I opened the zipper slowly, expecting anything, but outside was empty. No person, no animal, nothing out of place at first glance. The cold morning air hit my face, and only then did I realize how much I'd been sweating. I stepped out of the tent carefully and stood there looking around my campsite. That's when I saw the ground. The dry leaves and dirt around the tent were marked with human footprints. Many of them. They formed an almost perfect circle around the tent, as if someone had walked around it several times, observing. What made my blood run cold was realizing that there were no tracks leading away. The footprints just stopped there. I stood there staring at those footprints for far too long, trying to understand what I was seeing. They were clearly human, adult-sized, with defined sole patterns, not the messy marks of an animal. The soil was damp enough to hold the details, and you could see that some footprints overlapped, as if the person had made several laps around the tent. I followed the circle with my eyes, looking for any sign of an exit, some trail leading back into the woods or toward the campground path. There was nothing. The mark started near the front of the tent, made a full circle, and simply ended. It made no sense. There was no way someone could leave without leaving at least a few more tracks. I felt a chill run up my spine and an immediate urge to leave. I started packing my things in a rush, not even thinking about making coffee or organizing anything properly. I stuffed the sleeping bag into my backpack, took down the tent sloppily, always looking around, expecting to see someone standing among the trees. Every sound made me turn too fast. The campground was starting to wake up. You could hear car doors opening farther away, low voices, people beginning their day. That should have comforted me, but it didn't. On the contrary, it gave me the strange feeling that everything had returned to normal far too quickly, as if nothing had happened there during the night. I carried the collapsed tent to the car and threw everything into the trunk without even folding it properly. I just wanted to get out of that place. Before leaving the park, I stopped by the ranger's office to return the site card. I was trying to look normal, but I must have been pale because he asked if something had happened. I hesitated for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to say anything. I ended up mentioning, somewhat vaguely, that someone had been near my tent during the night. He got serious immediately and asked for more details. When I mentioned the pressure on the tent and the footprints around it, his demeanor changed completely. He didn't laugh or brush it off. He just said that I'd done the right thing by leaving early and asked exactly where I had been camping. He wrote down the site number and said he would take a look, but didn't explain anything further. That made me even more uneasy, because I had been expecting a simple explanation, not that heavy silence. I thanked him, got into the car, and left the park with a constant feeling of being watched in the rearview mirror, even though I knew there was probably no one there. It's been a while since that night, but I still think about it often. I've camped other times since then, always with other people, always in busier areas, and I've never experienced anything like that again. Even so, that experience completely changed the way I see this kind of thing. It wasn't a quick scare, and it wasn't something you can easily explain away as an animal or imagination. Someone was there. Someone stood around my tent, breathed close enough for me to hear, pressed against the structure, and left without leaving a clear path of exit. To this day, what bothers me most isn't the fear I felt at the time, but the sense that that person knew exactly what they were doing, and that the only thing that made it stop was me turning on the flashlight. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about what would have happened if I'd frozen for longer, or if the flashlight hadn't been right there beside me. And whenever I think about that, I remember the circle of footprints around the tent, closed, complete, as if someone had decided to leave the same way they arrived, without leaving any trail at all. Story 3. I'm 36 years old, married, and I have 2 young children. Last fall, during a free weekend, we decided to drive to a rural area of Arkansas to spend the day out and have lunch together. It wasn't anything heavily planned, just an attempt to break the routine. We found a state picnic area that was off the main road, very simple, with a few wooden tables, an open area, and dense woods all around. It wasn't peak season, so the place was practically empty. When we arrived, there were no other cars in the small dirt parking lot. That actually seemed like a good thing to us because we'd have peace and quiet. We parked near the table closest to the entrance of a short trail that led to the public restroom. We took the food out of the car, put the backpack under the table, and spread a few things on top. Water bottles, a phone, keys, the kids' toys. The day was overcast but bright, with that light cold air that makes everything quieter. The kids ran around the table a bit while my wife organized lunch. Everything seemed normal, quiet, almost too quiet, but nothing that stood out. After a few minutes, we decided to all go to the bathroom together before eating, since it was just a few meters away. We left everything on the table without a second thought, because there was absolutely no one else around. The path to the bathroom was short, a dirt trail surrounded by trees on both sides. You could see the picnic table almost the entire time, only losing sight of it in the last few meters when the trail made a slight curve. We were gone only a few minutes. The kids went in first, my wife stayed with them, and I waited outside, looking around out of habit. The place was still completely silent. No cars arriving, no sound of footsteps, nothing. I remember thinking that this kind of silence always seemed louder than any noise. When we finished, we all walked back together along the same path, talking about the food and telling the kids not to run so much. When the table came back into view, I felt something was wrong immediately. My brain took a second to process it, because I was absolutely certain there had been no one there when we left. A man was sitting right on the bench at the side of the table, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, going through our things. He was holding one of the water bottles and had taken several items out of the backpack, spreading them across the table. The kids stopped walking instantly. My wife grabbed their arms without saying a word. The man slowly looked up when he noticed us approaching. He didn't seem surprised, he just stared at us in silence, then looked at the children again. My body went on alert immediately. I took a few steps forward, instinctively placing myself between him and my kids, and asked what he was doing there. My voice came out firmer than I felt inside. The man didn't answer. He just stayed seated, looking first at me, then at my wife, and then at the children again, with a blank, hard-to-read expression. It wasn't exactly aggressive, but it wasn't confused or startled either. It was as if he were silently evaluating something. That's when I noticed he had fully opened our backpack and taken out small items, as if he were examining them one by one without any hurry. My wife pulled the kids a bit farther back, and I felt that cold, controlled fear that comes when you know you need to stay calm so things don't get worse. I repeated the question, this time saying that those things were ours and that he needed to get up. This time he finally reacted. He didn't speak. He just stood up, slowly enough to feel unnatural, pushed the bench back with his leg, and stood there in front of the table. He was taller than I'd expected, thin, wearing simple clothes dirty with soil. For a moment I thought he might say something, but instead he just looked away and started walking toward the woods without looking back. We all stood there, watching him leave, not knowing exactly what to do. He walked in a straight line, entering the trees with no sense of urgency at all, as if he knew we wouldn't follow him. He didn't run, didn't speed up, didn't show any rush. Within seconds, his body was swallowed by the woods until only the faint sound of leaves moving remained. Even after he completely disappeared from view, none of us moved. The kids were silent, something rare for them, and that alone said a lot. The place felt even emptier than before, as if his presence had drained any sense of normalcy. When we finally approached the table again, I felt immediate discomfort. The things weren't just out of place, they had been handled in a specific way. The backpack was fully open, the zipper pulled all the way. Some objects had been taken out and put back, but in different positions. It didn't look like someone searching for money or food. It looked like someone testing. That's when my wife picked up her phone, which had been left on the table, and realized it was turned off. Not on silent, completely powered off. She was certain it had enough battery before we went to the bathroom. That made my stomach drop. I took her phone in my hand and tried to turn it on. The screen stayed black for a few seconds before showing the startup symbol, as if someone had deliberately held the power button until it shut down. That gave me a very specific feeling of violation, more unsettling than if something had been stolen. This wasn't carelessness. It was intentional. I looked around, trying to figure out how long the table had been out of our sight. It had been very little time, maybe 5 or 6 minutes at most. Enough time for someone to appear out of nowhere, sit down, calmly go through everything, turn off a phone, and then walk away. The kids started asking questions all at once: who the man was, why he touched our things, why he was looking at them. I didn't know how to answer. My immediate reaction was to pack everything up as quickly as possible. We didn't even consider eating there anymore. I started throwing things back into the backpack without organizing, glancing toward the edge of the woods with every movement. My wife kept the kids very close, almost pressed against her. I felt that quiet urgency to leave before anything changed again. Before closing the backpack, I noticed that some small items had been moved around, as if someone had counted them, weighed them, or simply observed them out of curiosity. Nothing valuable was missing. Wallet, keys, everything was there. That only made it stranger. It felt like the goal hadn't been to take anything, but to measure something about us. How long we were gone. How we reacted. As I closed the trunk, I had the unsettling feeling that we were still being watched. I didn't hear footsteps or branches breaking, but the silence had changed. It was the same place, the same trees, but it felt too attentive, as if every movement we made was being followed from somewhere in the woods. I got into the car with my hands slightly shaking and started the engine without hesitation. The kids stayed quiet in the back seat, something that usually only happens when they're truly scared. My wife stared out the side window, trying to see something among the trees, but she didn't say anything. We pulled out of the parking area slowly at first, just to avoid making unnecessary noise, and then I accelerated once we reached the main road. No car appeared behind us. No one came out of nowhere. Even so, I only started breathing a little easier when the place was far behind us. Later at home, I tried to rationalize everything calmly. I wondered if it could have been someone clueless, someone passing through the park, someone with mental health issues. But nothing explained the specific way he handled our things, the fact that he turned off the phone or his silent focus on the children. There were no direct threats, no words, and maybe that was the most disturbing part. To this day, when I think about that day, I think about the short window of time when we were away from the table, about how someone managed to use exactly that moment to test boundaries, observe reactions, and leave without a trace beyond discomfort. We've never stopped in isolated areas during the off-season again, and we never leave our things unattended anymore, not even for a few minutes. Because that afternoon in Arkansas made one thing very clear to me. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. It just watches, measures, and decides to leave when it wants. Story 4. I was 21 years old at the time and in my 3rd year of college, living alone in a small apartment in a mid-sized city in the state of Washington. Near where I lived, there was a short urban trail, the kind that gets squeezed between residential neighborhoods and preserved wooded areas. It wasn't remote, but it also wasn't busy all the time. I used to walk there in the late afternoon to clear my head after classes. On that specific day, I had spent hours studying and was mentally exhausted, so I decided to take a quick walk before it got dark. I had walked that route dozens of times before, and nothing strange had ever happened. I arrived at the trail entrance around 6 in the evening. The sun was already low, filtering light through the trees, and the air was cold but pleasant. There were a few cars parked on the nearby street, which gave me a false sense of security. I entered the trail wearing headphones, the music low, more to muffle the sounds of the city than to truly distract myself. The path was narrow, packed dirt, with tall trees on both sides and some stretches where the vegetation closed in more. There was no one else in sight when I entered. Even so, I didn't find it strange. That time of day was usually quiet. I walked at a comfortable pace, looking more at the ground than around me, just letting my mind empty. After a few minutes, I took one of the earbuds out of habit, something I always do when it starts to get dark. That's when I noticed footsteps behind me. At first I thought it might just be an echo or someone entering the trail after me. I didn't turn around right away. I kept walking, trying to identify the sound more carefully. The footsteps had a very defined rhythm, neither fast nor slow, exactly matching my own pace. When I slowed slightly because of a root in the path, the sound behind me slowed too. That made me alert, but I still tried not to jump to conclusions. A few seconds later, I decided to stop, pretending to adjust my shoelace. I bent down slowly and stayed there, motionless, watching out of the corner of my eye. The footsteps behind me stopped as well. I didn't hear anyone approaching or moving away, just silence. My heart started beating faster, and I felt that cold sensation creep up the back of my neck. I stood up and kept walking, now a bit faster. The sound of footsteps returned immediately, at the exact same rhythm. There was no variation, no hesitation. It was as if the person behind me was deliberately mirroring every movement I made. I started to feel genuinely nervous at that point. I took out the other earbud and held my phone in my hand, trying to look calm while already thinking about what I would do if I needed to call someone. The trail curved gently to the left, and for a moment I lost sight of the section behind me. Even so, the footsteps were still there, always at the same distance. It didn't feel like someone trying to catch up to me, nor like someone distractedly walking. It felt like someone adjusting their pace based on mine, which is a very hard sensation to explain until you experience it. Every time I changed my speed, the sound adjusted immediately without delay. I decided to test it more clearly. I stopped again, this time without pretending to do anything, just stood there in the middle of the trail. Silence followed instantly. No extra step, no sound of someone shifting their weight. I felt a tight knot in my chest because that confirmed what I had been trying to deny. Someone was there behind me, standing still, watching me, waiting for my next move. I didn't turn around. The idea of facing that person head-on in that narrow corridor of trees gave me an almost physical fear. I stood there for just a few seconds and then started walking again, my heart pounding. The footsteps resumed with me. At that point, I had no doubt it wasn't a coincidence. I began to speed up on purpose, walking faster than was comfortable on that uneven ground. The sound behind me sped up as well, with no apparent effort. There was no heavy breathing, no stumbling, just that controlled, steady rhythm always matching mine. My head started spinning with practical thoughts. How far it was to the end of the trail, whether I should run, whether running would make things worse. I looked ahead and saw the section where the vegetation closed in more tightly, a point where the trail looked like a tunnel of trees. The idea of going through that with someone so close behind me made my throat tighten. Still, I kept walking because stopping there didn't feel safe either. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it might just be someone strange, someone unaware of how their behavior looked. But my body didn't believe that. My hands were sweaty, the phone nearly slipping, and I felt that pressure in my stomach that comes when you know something is wrong, even if you can't explain why. In a wider section of the trail, I suddenly slowed down, almost stopping. The footsteps behind me slowed immediately. I stopped completely. Silence. I didn't hear anyone shift their weight or step on leaves. It was as if the person behind me had frozen along with me. That was more frightening than if they had kept walking. I decided I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. The trail wasn't long, but in that moment it felt endless. I started walking with firm steps, trying not to panic and run blindly. With every meter, I expected to feel someone touch me, a hand on my arm, anything, but that didn't happen. What continued was that perfect mirroring. I walked, he walked. I slowed for a route, he slowed. I sped up in a more open stretch, he sped up too. There was no mistake, no delay. It was as if he was completely focused on me and nothing else. The sound of footsteps was always the same, neither closer nor farther, which gave me the impression that he wanted to maintain exactly that distance. That made me even more nervous because it felt intentional, calculated. When I finally saw the trail exit, I felt immediate relief mixed with fear. I could see the main street ahead with cars passing and a few houses with lights on. It felt like another world compared to the dark corridor of trees behind me. I sped up a little more, nearly tripping from nerves, and the footsteps followed again. As soon as I stepped onto the asphalt, I stopped abruptly, turned my body and looked back for the first time since it all began. The man was standing exactly at the trail entrance, where the dirt meets the sidewalk. He didn't take another step. He stayed there motionless, partially covered by the shadow of the trees, watching me. He didn't try to cross onto the street. He didn't make any gesture. He just watched, as if that boundary mattered to him. I stood there on the sidewalk for a few seconds, my legs shaking, trying to process what I was seeing. The contrast was surreal. Behind me, cars passed, people walked dogs, normal life went on. In front of me, the dark trail entrance looked like a silent hole in the middle of the city. The man was still there, standing in the exact same spot, not taking a step forward. He didn't seem indecisive. He seemed like he had reached where he wanted to go. His face wasn't fully visible because of the tree shadows, but I could tell he was watching me closely. There was no hurry, no apparent frustration that I had left the trail. That made me more uncomfortable than if he had tried to continue. After a few seconds that felt far too long, he took a step backward, still without taking his eyes off me, and blended into the darkness among the trees. He didn't run. He didn't turn away quickly. He simply retreated until he disappeared completely. I stayed there for a while longer, phone in hand, breathing deeply, trying to slow my heart. People passed by me on the sidewalk and I felt strangely out of place, as if I had returned from somewhere no one else had been. When I finally managed to move, I went straight home, looking back several times, even knowing he was no longer there. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it could have been a misunderstanding. Someone with a strange walking style, someone distracted. But nothing explained the perfect synchronization of the footsteps, or the fact that he stopped exactly where the trail ended. I passed by that entrance again several times after that, always during the day, always with more people around. I never saw the man again. Even so, I never entered that trail near dusk again. To this day, when I'm walking alone and hear footsteps behind me, my body reacts before my mind does, because that afternoon in Washington taught me that not every pursuit involves running or shouting. Sometimes it happens in silence, at the same pace as yours, until the moment someone decides to stop. Story 5. I was 27 years old when this happened, and the idea for the trip was completely simple. A childhood friend of mine, Mark, and I wanted to spend a cheap weekend out of the city. No noise, no internet, and not many people around. We ended up finding a small cabin to rent in a rural area of West Virginia, surrounded by woods and near a creek where you could fish. The photos looked normal, nothing luxurious, but clean and functional. It was exactly what we wanted. We arrived on a Friday afternoon after driving along roads that became increasingly narrow and poorly marked. The last stretch was a dirt road, lined with tall trees on both sides, with no houses visible nearby. The sense of isolation was strong, but at the time it felt like part of the charm. The cabin was simple: 2 small bedrooms, a living room with a couch and fireplace, a basic kitchen, and 1 bathroom. There was a door in the front, 1 in the back, and several low windows, most of them without curtains. You could see the woods starting just a few meters from the house. The silence was constant, broken only by the sound of the creek and the wind in the trees. We put our things away, opened a few beers, and spent the afternoon fishing and talking, enjoying the cold weather. When it started to get dark, we made food, locked the doors more out of habit than fear, and sat in the living room. There was no cell service, and the TV only picked up a few poorly tuned local channels. Nothing seemed wrong. It was just a normal weekend, or at least that's what we thought at the time. Night fell quickly in that area. After 9 o'clock outside, it was practically total darkness, with no lighting at all beyond the weak porch light. The fireplace was lit, and the house had that smell of burned wood mixed with old dampness. We talked quietly, more because of the silence around us than for any other reason. At one point, Mark commented on how strange it was not to hear absolutely anything besides nature. No cars, no airplanes, no human sounds. I agreed, but didn't think much of it. In places like that, silence is usually part of the package. Around 11, we turned off the living room lights and each went to our own bedroom. I stayed in the back bedroom and he took the front one. The interior doors stayed open, as if that made the space feel less closed in. I was almost asleep when I heard the first strange sound. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was a soft metallic click coming from the living room. I opened my eyes immediately, trying to figure out whether it was the wind or the house settling. A few seconds later, I heard a similar sound again, this time closer, as if someone were slowly turning a doorknob. My body went on alert immediately. I sat up in bed and listened, my heart starting to race. The sound wasn't rushed. It was controlled, careful, as if someone were testing something, evaluating it, and then moving on to the next point. I stayed still, trying to map the sounds through the house. After the living room doorknob, I clearly heard a light scraping on the kitchen window pane, followed by another soft click. It wasn't someone trying to force entry. There was no impact, no attempt to break in. It was almost too methodical. Test, stop, move on. The feeling it gave me was worse than if someone had been trying to break in by force. It felt like someone checking possibilities, as if silently taking inventory of the house. I got up slowly and went to my bedroom door, opening it just a crack to see the dark hallway. I didn't see anyone, but the sounds continued, now coming from outside the wall of my room. I called Mark quietly. It took a few seconds for him to answer, also whispering, asking if I was hearing it too. Just the fact that he confirmed it wasn't in my head made my stomach turn. We both stayed silent, each in our own room, listening. The person or people kept calmly testing everything. Front door, side window, back door. Always the same pattern, a touch, a click, a pause, and then the next spot. No talking, no hurried footsteps, just the muffled sound of someone moving around the house. At some point, the sounds got too close. I clearly heard the back door doorknob being turned carefully, as if someone were holding it firmly to avoid making noise. Then came the same light scraping on the nearby window, well below eye level. I could imagine a hand moving across the glass, searching for a flaw, a weak point. My body was rigid, and I realized I was holding my breath without noticing. There was no anger in the movements, no urgency. That was what scared me the most. Whoever was there had all the time in the world. They didn't seem scared or impulsive, they seemed comfortable. Then the sounds began to move toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. First, a quick test at the living room door. Then an almost imperceptible scraping at the narrow hallway window. Each sound was separated by a few seconds of silence, as if the person were thinking about the next move. Mark and I didn't say anything anymore. The silence between one sound and the next was so heavy it felt like part of the test. When I heard the light touch on the door of the front bedroom where Mark was, my stomach dropped. The doorknob moved once, very slowly, and stopped. There was no insistence, just that check, followed by a few seconds of absolute silence. Shortly after, I heard the sound shift down the hallway toward my room. Each step outside the wall seemed calculated, careful not to make the floor creak. When the doorknob of my door was touched, it was different from the others. There wasn't an immediate click. First, there was a light pressure, as if someone were testing whether the door was merely closed. Then came the slow turn of the knob, all the way to its limit, and then nothing. The sound stopped there. I didn't hear the person move on to another window nor return to the front door. It was as if they had arrived exactly where they wanted to be. The silence that settled in was absolute, heavy, and lasted far too long to be comfortable. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears and was sure that if I moved, I'd make too much noise. We stayed like that for several minutes, maybe more, with no other sound coming from outside. Mark and I texted each other on our phones, even without service, just so we wouldn't make any noise. He asked if I thought the person was still there. I didn't know how to answer. There were no footsteps moving away, no branches breaking, nothing to indicate a departure. It was as if someone had simply stopped outside my bedroom, listening. At some point, exhaustion began to set in, but fear wouldn't let my body relax. I eventually fell into a shallow sleep, the kind where any minimal sound wakes you immediately, always with the feeling that something still wasn't over. I woke up with the sky already lightening, that cold morning light coming through the cracks in the window. For a few seconds, I thought it had all been a bad dream, until I remembered the heavy silence of the night before. I left my room slowly and found Mark in the kitchen, with the same tired look I knew I must have had. Neither of us needed to ask anything. The first thing we did was check the doors. All of them were still locked, exactly as we had left them. None looked forced, no locks damaged. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. If someone had tested everything so carefully, the lack of damage only confirmed that it had been intentional. When we went to the living room window, we saw the marks. There were clear fingerprints on the outside of the glass, right at the height where someone would place a hand to look inside. They weren't random smudges of dirt. You could see the shape of the fingers, as if the person had pressed hard enough to leave a trace. Outside, on the damp ground, there were human footprints all around the house. They made a complete circle around the cabin, passing by every door and window. What stood out most was that there was no clear path of arrival or departure. The footprints simply surrounded the house as if someone had walked in circles, evaluating, and then disappeared into the woods without leaving any clear trail. We didn't discuss it much after that. The decision to leave was immediate, almost automatic. We started packing in silence, each of us alert to any sound coming from the woods, even with the sun already high. The cabin looked different in daylight, smaller, more exposed, as if it had lost the false sense of protection of the previous night. As I loaded the backpacks into the car, I couldn't help looking several times toward the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there, watching like the night before. There was no one. No movement, no sound besides the wind. That didn't bring relief. It only made everything stranger. It was hard to accept that someone had been there for hours, testing every point of the house, knowing exactly where we were, and then simply left without a clear trace. We drove away along the same narrow dirt roads, not talking much. From time to time, one of us would mention a detail we had remembered, like how long the sound stayed at the bedroom door, or the excessive care taken not to make noise. The more we talked, the clearer it became that it hadn't been someone lost or curious. There was no rush, no mistake, no desperate attempt to get inside. It was someone who wanted to know what was possible, how far they could go, and chose to stop exactly when they got too close. To this day, when I think about that night, what bothers me most aren't the marks on the windows or the footprints on the ground, but the final silence. The moment when the sound stopped outside my bedroom door, as if someone had decided they already had enough information. That made me understand that not every threat needs to fully reveal itself to be real. Story 6. I was 24 years old when this happened, and the hike had been my idea. Josh, Melissa, Ryan, and I lived in different cities, but whenever we could, we met up to do something outdoors. That weekend, we chose a relatively easy trail in rural Utah. Nothing technical, more walking than climbing. It was a beautiful place with low canyons, dry vegetation, and a narrow river cutting through part of the route. The forecast called for a clear day, so we didn't see a problem with starting the hike in the early afternoon, even knowing we'd be heading back near sunset. We'd done similar things before. The hike went normally for almost the entire route. We talked, took photos, and stopped a few times to drink water. The air started to cool as the sun got lower, and the light turned orange, reflecting off the rocks. On the way back, the number of people had dropped off a lot. Most groups had left earlier. The final stretch of the trail passed through a more enclosed area, and then across a narrow wooden bridge that crossed the river before the last section leading to the parking lot. It was a spot everyone crossed quickly, because there was no high guardrail and the sound of the water below echoed strangely. As we approached the bridge, the sun was almost disappearing behind the rock formations, and the trail suddenly felt colder and quieter. The sound of the water running beneath the bridge seemed louder at that hour, echoing under the wooden structure. I was the first to cross, looking more at the ground than around me, just wanting to get it over with. That's when I noticed something strange below us. Under the bridge, leaning against one of the concrete supports, there was a man. He wasn't lying down asleep as I would have expected. He was awake, sitting there with his back supported, looking up, directly at whoever was passing. My step faltered for a second, but I kept walking, trying not to draw attention. When the others started to cross, it became impossible to pretend we hadn't seen him. The man followed each of us with his eyes, slowly turning his head as we passed. He was holding something metallic in his right hand. It was hard to tell exactly what it was, just that it reflected the little light that was left. It wasn't large, but it didn't look harmless either. He didn't say anything, didn't make any gestures, he just watched, far too quietly. That silence was what bothered me most. No request for help, no muttering, nothing. Just that overly focused gaze on people who were there by chance. As soon as we crossed the bridge, I looked back out of reflex and saw that the man had stood up. It wasn't fast or abrupt. He rose calmly, slipped the metallic object into his jacket pocket, and began climbing the small embankment that led from under the bridge up to the trail. That made my stomach drop. There was no rush in his movements, but there was no hesitation either. He simply decided to leave that spot at that moment, right after watching us cross. Melissa noticed too and asked in a low voice if we had seen that. No one answered right away, but we all started walking a little faster without saying a word. The stretch after the bridge was straight, with the trail clearly marked between low shrubs and rocks. The sound of footsteps behind us became clear far too quickly to be a coincidence. They weren't heavy or irregular steps. It was someone walking steadily, keeping their distance but not falling behind. When we slowed a bit to go around a rock, the rhythm behind us slowed too. When we sped up, the footsteps followed. No one spoke for several minutes, but you could feel the tension in the whole group. That uneasy feeling of being followed started to grow, because it didn't feel like someone just heading the same way by chance. It felt like someone who had chosen to follow us. The sky darkened faster than expected, and the trail began to lose definition as shadows took over the path. Josh suggested quietly that we speed up to the parking lot, which couldn't be far. No one disagreed. We started walking faster, almost at a marching pace, trying not to look desperate, but the fear was already there, clinging to us. The footsteps behind us stayed at the same rhythm, always at the same distance. There was no heavy breathing, no sign of effort. It was as if the man had total control over his body and the pace he kept. At one point, I dared to glance over my shoulder. He was there a few meters behind us, walking with his head slightly lowered but his eyes fixed on us. He didn't look irritated or hurried. He looked patient. The closer we got to the final section of the trail, the clearer it became that he wasn't going to give up on his own. The vegetation started to thin out, and in the distance we could see the faint reflection of the parking lot lights between the trees. That gave us a bit of hope. We began walking right on the edge between fast walking and running, stepping around rocks without much care. The man behind us also sped up, but never to the point of trying to catch us. He kept that constant distance as if he knew exactly how far he needed to go. The absence of any words made everything heavier. No warning, no threat, nothing that explained his intention. When we finally left the trail and entered the open area of the parking lot, I felt immediate relief mixed with a different kind of fear, more exposed. The place was nearly empty, just a few scattered cars and a yellow streetlight that didn't illuminate everything properly. We walked straight to our car without even discussing who would get in where. Josh's keys trembled in his hand as he unlocked the door. I could still hear footsteps behind us, now muffled by the gravel of the parking lot. We didn't run, but we didn't stop either. We got into the car too quickly to look natural. The doors slammed almost at the same time, and the engine started on the second try, which made my heart race even more. As the car began to move, I looked through the rear window without even thinking. The man had stopped at the trail entrance, exactly where the dirt met the parking lot. He didn't take another step forward. He just stood there, body straight, watching as the car pulled away. He didn't raise a hand or make any gesture. He didn't seem frustrated that we were leaving. On the contrary, his posture gave the strange impression that this had been expected, as if he knew he didn't need to go any farther. The car's lights illuminated his face for a second, long enough for me to see that his expression was still blank, almost too calm for the situation. We drove for several minutes in absolute silence after leaving the parking lot. No one turned on the radio, no one commented right away. It was as if speaking might bring it all back closer to us. Only once we were on the main road, with reflective signs and distant lights from other towns, did Josh break the silence and say that what had happened was far too wrong to be a coincidence. Everyone agreed. We went over every detail out loud, almost as a way to confirm that we had all seen the same thing. The man awake under the bridge, the metallic object in his hand, the way he waited for us to cross, the exact moment he decided to follow us. None of it felt impulsive. It felt calculated, as if he had chosen that specific spot to watch people pass and decide whether it was worth following them. That left me with a discomfort that's hard to explain. because it meant we hadn't been chosen by chance in that moment. What bothered us most was how it all ended. He didn't chase the car. He didn't shout or try to get closer when we reached the parking lot. He simply stopped, exactly at the boundary of the trail, and watched. That image stayed stuck in my head for days. He didn't look like someone frustrated by a missed opportunity. He looked like someone satisfied with how far he'd gone, as if following us to that point had been enough, as if the rest wasn't necessary. After that night, none of us ever went back to that trail. Now, whenever I pass under narrow bridges on hikes, even in busy places, I find myself looking down without meaning to. Because that afternoon in Utah made it clear to me that sometimes danger doesn't run after you. Sometimes it just follows, watches, and stops exactly when it decides it knows enough. In the days that followed, I tried to go on with life as normal, but that scene kept coming back to me without warning. Sometimes it was the way he sat under the bridge, far too awake for someone who might supposedly be sleeping there. Sometimes it was the quick glint of the metallic object in his hand while there was still light. None of us could identify what it was. It could have been a small knife, a tool, anything. The problem was that he didn't seem to be holding it by accident. He was ready. We also talked about the exact moment he decided to stand up. It wasn't when the first person crossed or when the last one stepped onto the bridge. It was when all of us were already on the other side, when there was no easy way back. That part always gave me a different kind of chill, because it felt like a conscious decision made at the right time. Even today, when I think about that night, what unsettles me most isn't the fear I felt, but his calm. He never showed urgency, anger, or frustration. He didn't chase us, didn't try to get too close, didn't do anything that could be described as a direct attack. And maybe that's exactly what makes it all more disturbing. He was awake when no one expected. He watched in silence. He followed without effort, and he stopped at the exact moment he chose to stop, as if that trail, that bridge, and that boundary were part of something only he understood. We left thinking we had escaped something, but to this day I wonder if in reality he simply decided we weren't what he was waiting for. Story 7. I'm 30 years old and live in rural Pennsylvania, in a small town where everyone knows at least someone in common. At that time, I worked in an office and often got out late, especially on report deadline days. One Friday, a friend of mine, Rachel, texted me saying she had gone for a short walk in a state park not too far from there, and that it was taking longer than she expected to get back. She sounded a bit nervous but said she was okay and just needed a ride because her car was with her sister. I hesitated because it was already getting dark, but she insisted it would be quick and that she just needed me to pick her up at the main parking lot. I knew the park by sight, but I'd never been there late. Still, I got in the car and went. The drive there was very empty. Narrow roads, stretches without lighting, and those reflective signs warning about deer crossing. The farther I drove, the more I realized how impulsive that decision had been. I tried calling Rachel on speaker, but she didn't answer. I sent a message asking exactly where she was, and she just replied, "I'm already getting to the parking lot, I swear." That made me irritated and worried at the same time. When I turned into the park entrance, I noticed there were no cars passing, and that the place was far too dark to be a normal, busy parking lot. I was still trying to convince myself it was just because it was late and off-season. As soon as I pulled into the parking lot, I felt an immediate sense of discomfort. The space was bigger than I remembered, with several empty spots and only one light pole partially working, flickering faintly. I turned off the radio without realizing it, just to hear the surroundings better, as if that would help somehow. The sound of the car engine felt too loud in that silence. There were no other vehicles there. None. I slowed down and started looking for Rachel, imagining she might be walking toward the entrance. That's when I saw the person sitting on the wooden bench near the edge of the parking lot, facing where the cars park. It was a solitary figure, sitting upright, feet on the ground, hands resting on their knees. They were staring directly at my car. They didn't turn their head when I entered, didn't react to the engine noise, nothing. They just sat there looking. The weak light didn't allow many facial details, just the outline of the body and a posture that was far too rigid for someone resting. My first thought was that it might be Rachel, but that idea fell apart almost immediately. The posture wasn't hers. And she would have waved or at least stood up when she saw me. That person remained completely motionless. I slowed down even more and stopped the car a few meters away without turning off the engine. I stared, trying to identify any detail that might help me understand who that person was. They didn't look like someone waiting for a ride nor someone resting after a walk. It was as if they were there simply to occupy that bench at that specific time. I grabbed my phone and sent another message to Rachel asking exactly where she was. As I typed, I felt a strange urge not to take my eyes off the person for too long, as if looking away might make something change. They kept staring at me, not moving, not shifting their arms, not even changing the position of their head. The silence was so heavy that I began to notice too many details. The distant sound of insects, the wind moving the trees farther back, the crackling sound of the car cooling down. Still, the person on the bench didn't react to any of it. I thought about rolling down the window and asking if they needed help, but the idea of drawing attention verbally gave me an immediate chill in my stomach. Instead, I turned on the car's high beams, pointing them directly at the bench. The light illuminated the person's entire body at once. They didn't move. They didn't shield their eyes, didn't turn their face, didn't make any gesture of discomfort. They stayed seated, looking straight at me as if the light made no difference at all. At that moment, any doubt I still had turned into pure fear. A normal reaction would have been at least to blink, turn away, raise a hand. But that person did absolutely nothing. The bright light lit up the bench and the ground around it, and I still couldn't clearly make out the face, just the unmistakable sensation that their eyes were fixed on me. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I quickly looked to both sides, searching for Rachel somewhere in the parking lot, near the trees or the park entrance, but I saw no one. No moving shadows, no sound of footsteps. The person on the bench was the only human presence there, and that made everything feel even more wrong. I felt an immediate urge to leave. I didn't think about backing up carefully or maneuvering properly. I just turned the steering wheel and made a U-turn right there, gravel crunching loudly under the tires. As the car spun around, I looked in the rearview mirror almost without meaning to. The person was still sitting on the bench, in the exact same position, now watching the car drive away. They didn't try to stand up, didn't take a step toward me, didn't make any gesture that suggested urgency. That was what scared me the most. They didn't look like someone who had lost a ride or needed help. They looked like someone who had already seen what they needed to see. I sped out of the parking lot faster than I should have, hands sweaty on the steering wheel with the clear feeling that I had just escaped something I didn't understand. Only when I was several minutes away from the park did I manage to pick up my phone again. I called Rachel with shaking hands, and this time she answered on the second ring. The first thing I asked was where she was, and her answer confused me immediately. She said she had left the park almost 40 minutes earlier, after realizing it was getting too dark. She said she got a ride from a couple who were leaving at the same time and had even sent me a message to let me know. But the signal inside the park was bad. I checked my messages afterward and there really was one sent before I arrived at the parking lot, but it had only been delivered minutes later. I stayed silent for a few seconds, trying to process what that meant. I asked if she had seen anyone sitting on a bench in the parking lot when she left. She said no, that the parking lot had been completely empty. I got home still on high alert, locking the door too quickly and turning on all the lights. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night. The image of the person sitting on the bench unmoving even under the high beams came back every time I closed my eyes. It wasn't exactly fear of having been followed, but the feeling that something was out of place, behavior that didn't fit any simple explanation. The next day, still unsettled, I decided to call the park's information number. I wanted to confirm the operating hours, maybe to convince myself there was some logic to it. That's when the attendant told me, very casually, that the park officially closed at sunset and that after that time, there was no permitted access and no public transportation passing nearby. I asked if there was any kind of shelter, staff house, or bus stop near the parking lot. The attendant said no, that after closing only authorized staff could be there, and even then only during quick patrols. There was no camping, no bus lines, nothing operating at that hour. The way she spoke, far too calmly, made me swallow hard. I thanked her and hung up, standing there for a few seconds with the phone in my hand, staring at the kitchen wall. The obvious question started pounding in my head. How had that person gotten there? There was no transportation, no cars, and the park was already closed when I entered. They weren't waiting for a ride. They weren't someone who wandered in by accident. I spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had walked in from the road. Maybe they had ignored the closing time. But no explanation felt truly satisfying, especially when I remembered that person's posture. They didn't look tired, confused, or annoyed to be there. They didn't show surprise when a car entered an empty parking lot. They didn't react to the bright lights. They didn't react to my leaving. It was as if being there, sitting on that bench in that empty parking lot at that specific time, was exactly what was supposed to be happening. To this day, whenever I pass near that park, I avoid looking toward the entrance after dark. I've never gone back there, not even during the day. What bothers me most isn't imagining who that person was, but the certainty that they were there without needing to be, as if they didn't depend on a car, a ride, or operating hours. As if they had simply chosen that bench in that empty parking lot to watch whoever showed up. And that night, the only person who showed up was me.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.